My name is Mia, and I'm 29 years old. 10 years ago, my mother called me 3 days before Christmas and said 5 words that shattered everything. I thought I knew about family. Don't come home this year. The phone call was brief, almost clinical, like she was reading from a script. No warmth, no hesitation. Just those words. And then silence. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the phone in my hand. I could hear the faint hum of the street outside. The world going on as if nothing had happened. But inside me, something had cracked wide open. I had been preparing myself for this moment for years. I knew how it felt to be the one who didn't belong, the one who was always left on the edges of family events. But to be explicitly told that I wasn't wanted for Christmas, that was different. It was a wound, clean and deep. My mother's voice echoed in my head as I stood up. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach, but there was no pain. Just cold. There was always a gap in our relationship, a space where I had to keep proving myself. But I never expected it to be this final. I don't know what I expected, but it wasn't this empty, brutal truth. I pressed my fingers to my lips, trying to steady myself. But I couldn't. The words repeated over and over, a loop that wouldn't stop. Don't come home this year. There was no explanation. No, I'm sorry, or maybe next time. She didn't even ask why. I was just silence, like a door slamming shut with me on the other side. I walked out of my room, numb. The decorations on the walls, the lights twinkling from the tree, they all seemed to mock me now. Christmas had always been the one time of year I clung to, the one constant. The one day I had been sure I would be wanted, needed, and now it felt like a lie. I grabbed my coat from the hook by the door and pulled it on. But the motion was automatic, like a robot performing a task with no purpose. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. I just needed to get out of the house. My hands shook as I fumbled with the car keys. I needed something to fill the space that had just been emptied in me. But there was nothing. I drove for what felt like hours, but I didn't have a destination in mind. I didn't want to go home, didn't want to see the empty place where my family should have been. The road stretched ahead of me, empty and dark, much like how I felt. I could feel tears welling up in my eyes, but I couldn't let them fall. I couldn't let this hurt take me over. Not yet, not when I was so close to, I don't even know what. But then, as I drove past a small diner, I saw the glow of warm light spilling out from the windows. And I pulled over without thinking. Inside, the hum of quiet conversations and clinking silverware hit me all at once. The smell of coffee and eggs frying on the grill enveloped me. And for a moment, I almost felt like I belonged. I sat at the counter, my hands trembling as I ordered a coffee, my heart still racing from the phone call. The waitress brought it to me with a smile, a simple act of kindness, and for the first time in hours, I felt a small flicker of warmth. But even as I sipped the coffee, I couldn't stop the question from forming in my mind. Why wasn't I enough? Why wasn't I worth choosing? And as the cold weight of that thought settled in, I felt the walls close in on me again. Something inside me went quiet. Not sad, not angry, just empty. But as the darkness settled in, something else settled too. A quiet decision I didn't even fully understand. I woke up the next morning with the weight of the night still pressing down on me. But the coffee had worked its magic. The numbness had lifted, just enough to allow the memories to come flooding back. Memories of a lifetime spent trying to earn a place that I was never really invited to. I never thought about it much as a child. There were always excuses. There were always reasons why my mother's attention was elsewhere, why my father was silent. But as I grew older, I started seeing the pattern. How my little sister Victoria was always the one who shone brightest in their eyes. How everything was easier for her. She never had to ask for their approval because it was just given to her, like air. I remember the first time I noticed it. I must have been 8 or 9. It was my birthday. And I'd waited weeks for the day when my parents would finally make me feel special. Instead, I ended up with a half-hearted happy birthday, and a birthday cake that looked like it had been left in the fridge too long. Victoria's birthday, a few months later, was a different story entirely. The house was decorated with balloons. The table was filled with presents. She was the center of attention, of course, and I was pushed to the background like always. I remember standing there holding my own slice of cake, pretending to enjoy it while the room spun with laughter and celebration. That had nothing to do with me. I spent so many years fighting for scraps of attention. I tried to be better, to be more like Victoria. Maybe then they'd see me. Maybe then I could have a little piece of the love they so effortlessly gave her. I started excelling at school, getting straight A's, always doing what I was told. But no matter how much I gave, how much I sacrificed to make myself visible, it was never enough. It was like I wasn't meant to exist in the same space. Like I was a shadow, always behind, always second. And I couldn't understand why. Years went by, and it became a part of me. I walked into my apartment later that day, pulling the door shut behind me. I didn't have to go to a holiday gathering. I didn't have to make any effort to fit into their lives. I could just be, but it didn't feel like freedom. It felt like failure. I sat in the quiet of my living room, the harsh light from the window cutting through the dimness. The empty chair across from me seemed to mock me. It was the chair that should have been filled with someone who cared. But it had always been empty. The silence in my apartment pressed in on me, reminding me of all the things I had tried to ignore for so long. It wasn't just the Christmas call. It wasn't just the missed birthdays or the way I was always the second choice. It was the years of never being enough, of never being the one they chose, of always being the one to bend and break in the hopes that someday, just maybe, they would see me. I realized, sitting there in the silence, that I had spent my whole life trying to earn love from people who had never really given it to me. They were never going to choose me. And that was something I needed to accept. But that didn't mean I had to keep playing their game. I stood up slowly, walking over to the window. Outside, the city was bustling, full of life. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a small spark of something. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was something else. But I knew I wasn't ready to give up just yet. I wasn't ready to accept that this was all I deserved. I didn't want to be someone who just waited around for scraps anymore. I wasn't just going to let myself disappear into the background any longer. And maybe, just maybe, I could find a place where I didn't have to prove my worth. I turned away from the window and grabbed my coat again. There was a world out there, beyond the walls of my apartment, beyond the confines of the family I had been born into. Maybe it was time to step into it. But the question lingered as I stepped outside. What if this time I was chosen? I learned how to hide my hurt, how to smile through the pain, how to pretend I didn't care when they'd leave me out of family events. Or worse, make excuses for why I couldn't come home for holidays. When I got the call that morning, the one where my mother told me not to come home for Christmas, I wasn't surprised. I was hurt, yes, but not shocked. It had always been this way. But I think that was the breaking point for me. I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't be the one left waiting, left wanting, left in the cold. The days bled into one another in a blur of monotony. The weight of Christmas morning hung heavy in the air, the day when everyone else was gathering with family, laughing, exchanging gifts, and sharing the warmth of belonging. Meanwhile, I sat in my small apartment alone. I tried to distract myself. I worked on a few freelance projects, scrolling mindlessly through social media, seeing people I barely knew posting pictures of their families. The smiles, the warmth, the togetherness. And there I was, my only companion, the cold glow of my laptop screen. I ate a sad dinner that night, reheated leftovers from the previous week. Turkey that tasted like cardboard, mashed potatoes that were somehow both dry and mushy at the same time. I chewed mechanically, trying to ignore the hollow feeling growing in my chest. But I couldn't escape it. The silence in my apartment was deafening, each tick of the clock sounding like a reminder of everything I didn't have. No one was calling me. No one was reaching out. I closed my eyes for a moment, wishing for everything to feel different, for someone to come knocking on my door, telling me I was enough, telling me I mattered. But no one came. I spent the entire day pacing through my apartment, finding no solace in anything. I could feel the weight of my loneliness crushing me, suffocating me. I tried to call a few friends, but everyone was busy with their own families, their own celebrations. I couldn't blame them. How could I? Still, I felt the emptiness. It wasn't just the holidays. It was the absence of belonging that I had felt for years. The absence of being seen, truly seen, for who I was. I collapsed onto my couch, exhaustion settling in, but it wasn't the kind that comes after a long day of work. It was a deeper weariness, the kind that seeps into your soul when you've been running for so long, fighting for something you can never reach. Tears blurred my vision as I pulled my knees to my chest. I didn't know who I was anymore. The girl who used to believe in love? The one who thought she could make a family of her own? It all felt so distant now. I had spent so much of my life trying to fit into a mold that never fit me. I had tried to be what they wanted, and yet, every single time I fell short. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to scream, to curse them all for leaving me to face this alone. But I didn't have the energy for that. The anger had long since been replaced by a quiet, gnawing despair. Maybe it was better this way. Maybe I was better off alone. I hadn't realized how badly I had been holding on to hope until I felt it slip through my fingers. The hope that someday I would be chosen. But now it was gone. And in its place was the realization that I might never be chosen. At least not by the people I had wanted most. I was always going to be second. Always going to be the one left behind. The tears flowed freely now, hot and bitter, but I didn't try to stop them. There was no point. And there in that moment I felt a strange kind of clarity. Maybe I had been chasing something that wasn't meant for me. Maybe I wasn't supposed to be chosen by them. Maybe the only person who needed to choose me was me. But the question lingered in my mind. How do you choose yourself when everyone else has already chosen someone else? I wiped my face and stood up, feeling the weight of everything crash over me once more. There was no magic solution, no fairy tale ending, but maybe, just maybe, the first step in healing was understanding that I didn't need to chase their love anymore. I walked to the window, looking out at the city lights, barely visible through the glass. For a moment, the sadness didn't feel as heavy. I could see the world beyond the loneliness. The world that had always been there, waiting for me to step into it. And I knew then that I had a choice. But just as quickly as they had started, the tears stopped. The empty silence of the apartment filled the space once again. But something was different now. It wasn't peace. It wasn't relief. It was a cold acceptance. I had hit rock bottom. No one was there to see me, to make me feel better, to tell me everything would be okay. The first time I met them, I didn't think much of it. It was a typical Tuesday. Gray clouds hanging low in the sky as I stepped into the small bookstore downtown. I had been there before, but not often. It was quiet, tucked away from the main street, with shelves that seemed to stretch for miles in every direction. I wandered through the aisles, my fingers grazing the spines of books that offered a fleeting escape from the suffocating weight of my own life. But this time, I didn't just wander. I was searching for something. That's when I met Eleanor. She was standing behind the counter, a book in her hand, reading as if the world outside the store didn't exist. Her glasses were perched on her nose, and she wore a smile that felt genuine, not forced. I didn't know it then, but that smile would be the first piece of warmth I had felt in months. I walked up to the counter, unsure of what to say. I wasn't in the mood for small talk. But she greeted me first, her voice light and easy. "Looking for anything in particular?" she asked, her eyes lighting up as she noticed the book in my hand. A novel by one of my favorite authors. "I'm just browsing," I said almost too quickly. "Browsing can be good for the soul," she replied with a knowing smile. And for the first time in a long while, I felt seen. Not judged, just seen. I left the store with a few books tucked under my arm and a strange feeling in my chest. Eleanor had offered me no pity, no words of encouragement that would have felt empty. She had simply acknowledged me as I was. No expectations. No judgment. It was a small interaction, one that seemed so simple. But it stuck with me. Over the next few weeks, I found myself returning to that bookstore. At first, it was just to buy a new novel, to escape into a world that wasn't my own. But soon I found myself lingering longer, talking to Eleanor more. She didn't ask too many questions, and that was something I appreciated. She wasn't trying to fix me or offer advice. She just let me be. Eventually, she introduced me to her husband, George. He was quieter, steadier, but just as kind as Eleanor. Their interactions with one another were easy, natural, like two people who had spent years learning how to be together. One day, while I was there, I overheard a conversation that made me stop and listen. Eleanor was talking to George, and I heard her say something that stayed with me. We could always use more volunteers to help with the bookstore events. Maybe Mia would like to help. She seems like someone who could use a place to belong. At first, I wanted to brush it off. I wasn't ready to be part of something. I wasn't ready to be a part of anything after everything that had happened with my family. But there was something about the way Eleanor spoke. It wasn't pity. It wasn't an offer of charity. No trying to be something I wasn't. I was simply invited to be a part of something, with no strings attached. And that, I realized, was the most freeing feeling of all. The next few days were a blur of organizing books, setting up chairs, and meeting new people who passed through the bookstore. Each small interaction with someone new felt like a thread being woven into the tapestry of my life, a life that was no longer defined by the people who had rejected me, but by the people who were choosing to include me. As I helped Eleanor with the reading event, I felt something begin to shift inside me. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a sudden epiphany. But little by little, the walls I had built around myself began to crack. And somewhere deep inside, I began to hope. By the time the event was over, I was sitting at the counter with Eleanor and George, enjoying a quiet drink as the last of the attendees filtered out. I realized for the first time that I didn't need to be chosen by my biological family to find a place where I belonged. I was building my own family, one small interaction at a time. It was simply an invitation. She didn't ask me to be anything. I wasn't. She didn't try to make me fit into her world. She just wanted to share it with me. The next time I came in, I hesitated. But then I found myself walking up to her, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I'd like to help," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She smiled, as if she had been waiting for me to say it. "Great," she said, reaching behind the counter for a calendar. "We have a book reading coming up. Would you like to help set it up?" For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like an outsider. I didn't feel like I was trying to squeeze into a space that wasn't meant for me. There was no pretense here. The healing begins. It had been weeks since the bookstore event, and with every passing day, I found myself more entrenched in this new world, one that was soft, real, and accepting in ways I never imagined possible. Eleanor and George had offered me something I hadn't realized I needed: space. Space to breathe, space to exist, space to belong without having to perform, without having to prove myself. The healing had started slowly, like the first few gentle rays of sunlight breaking through the darkness. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't a sweeping transformation. But it was real, and it felt like the first step towards something new. I spent more time with Eleanor. We would sit in the small back room of the bookstore, sipping tea as we talked about everything and nothing. She never pushed me for details. She never asked about my past. She simply listened. And in that quiet, patient listening, I began to understand something important. Healing doesn't always need words. Sometimes it just needs presence. George, too, had his quiet way of offering comfort. He would show up in the mornings before the bookstore opened, preparing everything with a steady hand. And when he noticed my hesitation, when I started to doubt my place in this new space, he would simply give me a knowing smile, as if reminding me that I wasn't just allowed here, I was wanted. It was in those moments that I began to realize that they weren't just strangers. They were something more. They were the family I had always longed for, but never knew I could have. One evening, after a particularly long day of setting up for a new book release, Eleanor turned to me with a question that felt like it had been waiting to be asked. "Mia, how would you feel about joining us for Thanksgiving this year? I know it's not easy for you, but we would love for you to be a part of it." The question hung in the air between us, simple but monumental. I looked at her, unsure of how to answer. Thanksgiving had always been a day that dredged up memories of missed dinners, empty chairs, and the feeling of not being enough. But something about her offer felt different. It wasn't a pity invite. It wasn't a charity move. It was just a real invitation. For the first time in years, I felt the warmth of it. I took a deep breath and looked into Eleanor's eyes. "I'd like that," I said softly. It wasn't just about the food or the company. It was about the feeling that maybe, just maybe, I could experience what it was like to be fully seen, to be accepted, to be part of something that wasn't built on obligation or guilt, but on something real. As we sat down to eat, Eleanor placed a plate in front of me, her smile warm and genuine. "I'm glad you're here, Mia," she said quietly, and for the first time, I felt like I wasn't just in the room. I belonged in the room. I couldn't remember the last time I had been so relaxed, so at peace. As the evening unfolded, I found myself talking, laughing, sharing stories. Not the stories of my broken family, but new stories, the kind you make when you feel safe enough to let go. And that night, as the table was cleared and the last of the dishes were washed, Eleanor pulled me aside. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but full of meaning, "for being here, for being a part of our family." Something inside me shifted. I had spent so many years wondering why I couldn't be chosen by my biological family, why I wasn't worthy of that kind of love. But here, with these people who had no blood relation to me, no obligation to me, I was chosen. I didn't have to earn their love. It was just there, quietly, consistently, like the steady beat of a heart. I realized that the healing hadn't been about fixing what was broken. It had been about learning to be open to something new, something better. And in that quiet, intimate moment, I made a vow to myself. I would never again shrink away from love. I would never again believe that I wasn't worthy of being chosen. The next day, as I sat in my apartment, I realized that I was beginning to piece together the fragments of who I was. No longer the girl on the sidelines, the girl waiting for her turn. No longer the girl who was always second. I was becoming the woman who stood tall, who accepted love without conditions. Thanksgiving Day arrived, with the crispness of early autumn in the air. I dressed carefully, choosing something simple but warm, and made my way to Eleanor and George's house. The house smelled like roasted turkey, fresh bread and spices, familiar scents, but they didn't feel heavy with memory. Instead, they felt new, inviting. I walked in, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't nervous. I wasn't on guard. I wasn't wondering when the other shoe would drop. I just was, and that was enough. George was setting the table, and Eleanor was in the kitchen, humming as she worked. It was a small gathering, but it was full of life. Laughter, clinking glasses, the low hum of conversation that wasn't forced. It felt easy. It felt like home, the blossoming romance. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself not just healing but growing in ways I never imagined. Eleanor and George became more than just my chosen family. They were the safe harbor I never knew I needed, and with them, I felt something inside me start to shift, something stronger than the pain, stronger than the past. But it wasn't just them. There was someone else, someone who had quietly slipped into my life and stayed there, even when I wasn't ready to let anyone in. His name was Daniel. I met him at one of the bookstore's author events. He was tall, with an easy smile and eyes that always seemed to be focused on the conversation, like he was genuinely interested in what you had to say. He wasn't like anyone I had known before. He didn't come with the weight of expectations or history. He was just himself, and that made all the difference. At first, our interactions were brief. A passing smile here, a word or two about books we both loved. He was an artist, a photographer, and we found ourselves talking about our work, about our shared love for capturing the small, fleeting moments of life. But it wasn't just the art that connected us. It was the way he listened, the way he made me feel like I wasn't the sum of my past mistakes or the holes in my story. He made me feel seen in a way that was different from everyone else. One evening, as I was leaving the bookstore, I caught him standing by the door, his camera hanging loosely from his neck. "I was wondering," he said, his voice quiet but sure, "would you like to go out for coffee sometime? Just the two of us?" The request was simple, but it sent a rush of warmth through me, a feeling I hadn't allowed myself to experience in years. The idea of being seen, truly seen, by someone who wasn't carrying any baggage from my past was both thrilling and terrifying. I hesitated, but only for a moment. "I'd like that," I said, my voice a little softer than usual. Our first date was nothing spectacular, but it was everything I had been looking for. We sat in a quiet cafe, sipping our drinks and talking about everything and nothing. It wasn't a whirlwind. There were no grand gestures, no forced romance. It was just two people connecting, building something slowly, and in that slowness I found peace. Daniel had a way of making me feel safe, of making me laugh in a way that felt effortless. And as the evening went on, I realized that for the first time in a long time, I was allowing myself to just be. I wasn't worried about what he thought of me, or whether I was enough. I was simply there in the moment. And he seemed to appreciate that. He seemed to appreciate me. We saw each other more often after that, each time discovering new layers of one another. Daniel had his own wounds, his own past that he carried with him. But it was never heavy in the way my past had been. It was something he acknowledged, something he didn't hide, but he didn't let it define him. It felt like we were both learning how to share our lives, our worlds without the fear of rejection, without the need to perform. And in that space, something began to bloom between us. One night, as we sat on a bench outside the bookstore after another long day of setting up, he took my hand in his, the gesture so simple, but so incredibly intimate. He looked at me, his gaze steady. "I've been thinking about something," he said, his voice low. I don't want to rush anything, but I think I'm falling for you, Mia. The words landed softly, like the first drop of rain after a long drought. It wasn't a declaration I had been waiting for. It wasn't the climax of some grand romance. It was just the truth, spoken plainly, and somehow that made it mean so much more. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I just squeezed his hand, letting the silence speak for itself. I wasn't ready to say the same thing. Not yet. But I could feel it deep in my chest. I was starting to feel it. I'm falling for you too, I said quietly, the words coming without hesitation. It wasn't just about love. It was about trust, about two people who had been broken in their own ways, finding something whole in each other. In the weeks that followed, our bond grew stronger. We spent hours walking through the city, talking about everything: art, dreams, fears, hopes. He had a way of making me feel like I wasn't just a person with a past. I was someone with a future that didn't have to be defined by the hurt I had carried for so long. But even as our relationship blossomed, there was still a part of me that hesitated. The fear of losing someone, of being left behind, was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. But this time it wasn't overwhelming. It wasn't all-consuming. And one evening, as we sat together, watching the sunset over the city, I realized something. I wasn't just waiting for someone to choose me anymore. I was choosing myself. I was choosing him. I was choosing this new life, this new love, this new possibility. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like enough. The legal bond. The idea of permanent commitment had always been a double-edged sword for me. On one hand, it was the thing I had always dreamed of, the sense of belonging, the promise of never having to fight for a place in someone's heart. But on the other hand, it terrified me. What if it all fell apart? What if, despite everything, I ended up alone again, discarded like so many times before? It was a fear that had been ingrained in me for as long as I could remember. The fear that no matter how much love was given, it would never be enough to make up for the absence of the family I had always wanted. The family I had always hoped would choose me. But as the months passed, Daniel showed me a different kind of love. A love that wasn't conditional. A love that was steady, unwavering, like a river that flows whether or not you notice it. It was a love I didn't have to earn. It was just there. And so when he asked me, not with grand gestures or fanfare, but simply and quietly, if I would consider moving in together, something inside me said yes. There were no fireworks. There was no perfect moment. It was just the next step in a life that felt real. A life I was building with someone who chose me every day, without reservation. It was a Saturday afternoon when we started talking about something bigger, something that carried weight far beyond the decision to move in together. We were sitting on the couch, the sun filtering through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. It was quiet, peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos of my past. Mia, Daniel began, his voice low but steady, I've been thinking a lot about us, about everything. And I know it's not something we need to rush, but I want to make this official. I want to make you a part of my life in a way that's unbreakable. I looked at him, not entirely sure where this conversation was going, but trusting him enough to hear it through. Will you marry me, Mia? Will you make me your family? The question hung in the air between us, simple but profound. And in that moment, the fear that had always gripped me, the fear of losing something I had fought so hard to find, began to fade. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the steadiness in his eyes, the sincerity in his voice. I thought I'd always have to fight for a place in someone's life. I whispered, But I don't have to fight with you, do I? No, he said softly, shaking his head. You never had to. Not with me. That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. This was it. This was the moment I had always dreamed of. The moment I was finally being chosen. But it felt different than I had imagined. It didn't feel like a dream come true exactly. It felt like something real. Something grounded in trust, in everyday love, in showing up even when things weren't perfect. Marriage, the word still felt foreign, like something that belonged to a different version of me. But this version of me, the one who was healing, the one who had learned to stand tall in her own truth, could see that this was the next step. And in that step, I wasn't just choosing Daniel. I was choosing myself. I was choosing a future where I no longer had to be anyone but who I truly was. Weeks later, we sat down at the kitchen table, a stack of paperwork between us. We were preparing for our wedding, something so small and intimate, just the two of us, but it felt like a massive declaration. Not of love, because we had that, but of commitment, of permanence. I had never considered the idea of adult adoption before, but as I read through the forms, I understood what it meant. It wasn't just about becoming someone's legal partner. It was about becoming family, for real. Not out of obligation or blood, but out of choice. I looked at Daniel as he filled out his own section, his brow furrowed in concentration. When he noticed me looking, he paused and smiled. "It's funny," he said, his voice light. "I've never had to do anything like this before. But with you, it just feels right. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged to someone. I wasn't just the girl waiting for the scraps. I was a partner, a choice, a permanent fixture in someone's life." The day of the ceremony came and went, small and private, but it felt monumental in its quiet significance. As we exchanged vows, with only Eleanor and George standing witness, I knew that this was more than just a legal contract. It was the embodiment of everything I had been searching for: love, trust, and the knowledge that I had a place to stay, a place to grow, and a place to be loved fully, without conditions. But even then, the lingering question of what if still held a small corner of my heart. What if this all fell apart? What if, despite everything, I wasn't enough? As we sat together that evening, our hands intertwined, I realized that I didn't have to have all the answers. I didn't have to know exactly what the future held. All I needed to know was that I had chosen this life, and Daniel had chosen me. And in that simple truth, there was a peace I had never known before: the confrontation. The wedding was still fresh in my mind, a day of quiet promises, a day that marked the beginning of a new chapter in my life. But as much as I had embraced the warmth of the family I had found, there was still a part of me that couldn't escape the past. The shadow of my biological family loomed over me like a storm cloud, always just out of reach but never truly gone. I had spent so many years running from them, trying to ignore the hurt they had caused, trying to forget the sting of rejection, but I knew that I couldn't escape them forever. Not when they still held so much power over me. It was the day after our wedding when the call came. The one I had been dreading, the one I knew was inevitable. My phone rang, the screen flashing with a name I hadn't seen in years. Robert. My father. I let the phone ring twice, then answered with a shaky breath. "Mia," his voice came through the line, distant and cold, like it always had been. "I need to talk to you." I felt my stomach tighten. I hadn't heard from him in months, and now he was calling. After everything. "I'm listening," I said, my voice steady but laced with the tension I felt coiling in my chest. I heard about the wedding," he said, his tone almost casual, like it was some piece of gossip. "I just wanted to let you know that we don't approve of your decision." The words hit me like a slap, and for a moment, I felt my heart start to race. The old wounds, the old hurt came rushing back like a tide, pulling me under. But I didn't let it overwhelm me. Not this time. "You don't approve?" I repeated, my voice rising, though I couldn't stop the edge of pain that seeped through. "Is that what this is about?" "You don't get to approve, Dad. I'm not asking for your permission." There was silence on the other end, a long stretch of it, as if he didn't quite know how to respond. But when he did, his voice was thick with something I couldn't quite place. "You've always been too emotional. Mia, always making decisions based on how you feel. You never considered what's best for you. This marriage, it's a mistake." I felt a wave of anger flare up inside me, but I clamped down on it. I had been angry for so long, it no longer served me. What I needed now was something different. Clarity, boundaries. "This isn't about what's best for me. This is about what I want," I said, my voice firm. "And for the first time in my life, I'm choosing myself." But then his voice came through again, quieter, but laced with something I had never heard before. Guilt. I'm sorry, Mia, I didn't mean to hurt you." The apology hung in the air, fragile and half-formed, as if it had been buried for so long that it had no real weight to it. I didn't know if I could accept it or if I even wanted to. I had waited years for an apology like that, but now it didn't feel like enough. It didn't change anything. "I don't need your apology," I said, my voice steady but full of finality. "I needed you then, when I was still that little girl and you never showed up. I can't go back and change that." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and when he spoke again, it was quieter, almost resigned. "I know, I'm sorry. But Mia, you have to understand, you'll always be welcome here if you change your mind. I closed my eyes, feeling a strange mix of relief and sorrow. There it was, the final, inevitable truth. No matter how much I had hoped, I would never be the one to heal this relationship. I could never go back to being the person they wanted me to be. I had tried so hard to fit into their world, to bend myself into something that was never meant for me. And now I was free. I hung up the phone and sat there, my heart pounding in my chest. It was over. This was the moment. I had been waiting for the moment. I finally set the boundaries that had been long overdue. It wasn't just about the wedding. It wasn't about the fact that they hadn't been there, hadn't supported me. It was about the realization that I no longer needed their approval to move forward with my life. I had found my place not because they had chosen me, but because I had chosen myself. A few days later, Eleanor and George invited us over for dinner. Daniel was by my side, and as we walked into their warm, welcoming home, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. This was my family now. These were the people who saw me, who loved me without reservation. As I sat at the table, laughing with Eleanor and George, I realized that the confrontation with my biological family, the rejection, the guilt, the years of feeling like I didn't belong, had given me the clarity I needed to truly embrace this life. I didn't need their acceptance anymore. I had already found something far better, a family who chose me, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. I'm choosing a family that actually sees me, not one that leaves me in the background. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, I thought he might hang up, just like he always did when things got difficult. The aftermath. It had been several weeks since the confrontation with my biological family. Since that call from my father, there had been a quiet shift in me, a change I hadn't expected. I had braced myself for the emotional fallout, for the guilt, for the haunting ache of rejection that used to follow those moments when they dismissed me. But instead of collapsing under the weight of it, I found myself breathing more freely. The truth had finally settled in, like an old, worn-out coat that no longer served its purpose. I didn't need to wear it anymore. I spent the following days in a haze of reflection, taking time to process everything that had happened. I couldn't deny that a part of me still wanted more. I wanted them to see me, to understand the woman I had become, the one who no longer needed their validation. But I also realized that wanting them to see me, to finally choose me, was like chasing after something that had never belonged to me. It was like trying to pick up a broken vase, gluing the shards together and expecting it to be whole again. The pieces didn't fit anymore. So I let it go. The past, the pain, the longing for something that would never be. One evening, while I was sitting on the couch with Daniel, my mind drifted back to the conversations I'd had with my father. The apology he had given, one that was too little, too late, still echoed in my mind. But this time, it wasn't with sadness or anger. It was with the understanding that I didn't need to hold on to that apology anymore. I didn't need to keep revisiting the parts of my life that hurt. "I've been thinking," Daniel said, his voice breaking through my thoughts. "Maybe it's time for you to write them. The letters, I mean. It's a way to close it, for good. You know, so you don't carry it around anymore." I looked at him, his gentle suggestion hitting me harder than I expected. He was right. I had spent so long avoiding the idea of closure, afraid of what it might mean to truly let go. But now I saw that he wasn't just offering a suggestion. He was giving me the space to do what I needed to move forward, without fear, without regret. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I think that's a good idea." That night, I sat at my desk with a pen in hand, staring at the blank page in front of me. The letters had been a long time coming, but the weight of them still pressed against me. The first one was easy, too easy. I wrote it to my father. His words, his voice, had been so dismissive, so cold, that it was almost impossible for me to feel anything but a strange kind of pity for him. "Dad, I've spent so many years trying to make you proud, trying to fit into a space I was never meant to belong in. I wanted your love, your approval, and I tried to be what you wanted me to be. But in the end, all I got was silence. Silence and rejection. I'm done trying to prove myself to you. I've found a place where I belong, a place where I don't have to fight for my seat at the table. I've learned that love isn't about proving worth. It's about being chosen without conditions. I don't need your apology, Dad. What I need is for you to understand that I've made my peace with who you are and who I am, and that's enough. Goodbye." Nya. The second letter was harder. It was to my mother. She had always been the one I had sought the most approval from, the one I had wanted to impress. But with her, there was no apology. There was no acknowledgement of the years of neglect, no understanding of how deeply her absence had cut me. Mom, I don't know how to begin this. How do you write a letter to someone who was never really there? I wanted you to love me. I wanted you to choose me. But you always chose Victoria. And I couldn't understand why. I spent so many years trying to make you proud, trying to make you see me, and I never could. But I don't need your love anymore. Not the way I thought I did. I've learned that I don't need to be the second choice. I don't need to be the one who's left behind, the one who has to wait for a seat at the table. I've found my family now. People who see me, who love me for who I am. And for the first time, I'm not looking to you for approval. I'm looking to myself. This is goodbye. Mia. I sealed the letters in envelopes and set them aside. I didn't need to send them. Writing them was enough. It was my way of letting go, of giving myself the closure I had never been given. That night, Daniel held me as I lay in his arms. I didn't speak for a long time, but his warmth, his presence, his love, they filled the spaces where words could never reach. And for the first time in my life, I didn't need to explain myself. I didn't need to be fixed. I was finally enough, exactly as I was. I wasn't waiting for anyone to choose me anymore. I had already chosen myself. You called me after the wedding, after everything I've been through, and you told me it was a mistake. You told me I wasn't making the right decision, but you never asked me why. You never tried to understand. You just told me what you thought was right without ever truly seeing me. The reflection. The days following the letters were filled with a quiet kind of peace, one I had never known before. There were no more calls, no more expectations. The ghosts of my past, the ones who had haunted me for so long, finally began to fade into the background where they belonged. The letters had been my final act of freedom, my final piece of closure. I didn't need anyone else's approval. I had stopped asking for it. I had stopped begging for it. I was whole on my own, and in that wholeness, I found something I hadn't even realized I had been searching for. A sense of belonging that wasn't tied to blood or obligation, but to choice. I looked at Daniel one evening, our hands intertwined, and something deep within me shifted. Thank you, I said quietly, my voice thick with emotion. For choosing me. He smiled softly, squeezing my hand. I don't have to choose you, Mia, I already did. And in that moment, I realized that it wasn't just about the love we shared. It wasn't just about the vows we had taken or the promises we made to each other. It was about the fact that, despite everything, the hurt, the pain, the uncertainty, I had chosen to stand tall. I had chosen myself. Over time, I began to reflect on everything that had led me to this point. The girl who had spent so many years fighting for a place in a family that never saw her. The woman who had learned, through pain and loss, that the love I had craved wasn't something I had to earn. It was something I had to give to myself first. And as I stood there, looking out at the life I had built with Daniel, with Eleanor and George, with the people who chose me, truly chose me, I knew that I had learned the most important lesson of all. I didn't need to be perfect. I didn't need to be anyone else. I just needed to be me. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden light across our home. And as I looked out the window, I thought of everything that had brought me here. The hurt, the rejection, the longing. It all had a place, but it no longer had a hold over me. I've spent so many years trying to earn love from people who were never going to give it to me, I whispered to myself. And then I spent years learning what love actually looks like. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And that was enough. In the years that followed, I found myself looking back at my journey with a deep sense of gratitude. The pain, the rejection, all of it had shaped me, but it no longer defined me. I had built a life based on the love I had learned to give myself. And the people who had entered my world had become my true family. If you're watching this and you've been the scapegoat of your family, if you've been told you're too much or too sensitive, or always causing drama just because you dared to ask to be treated fairly, I want you to know something. It's not you. It never was. You deserve to be chosen. Not as a backup, not as a last resort, not as the acceptable sacrifice when someone else's comfort is at stake. Chosen first. Chosen fully. Chosen without conditions. Family isn't blood. Family isn't obligation. Family isn't people who share your DNA but treat you like a burden. Family is the people who show up. The people who see you crying alone and invite you to their table. The people who open their hearts and their homes and make you officially permanently, undeniably theirs. I spent years trying to earn love from people who were never going to give it. And then I spent years learning what love actually looks like. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. It helps more people find these stories when they need them most. I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to set boundaries with your own family? Share your experience in the comments. I read every single one. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love knowing how far this story reaches. And if you want more stories like this, check the description. I've linked some of my favorites there. Until next time, remember it, you deserve to be chosen. This is the end of our journey. I've shared the lessons, the growth, and the healing I've gone through. Now, it's your turn to step into your own light and choose yourself. Choose the family you deserve. You're already enough.